Russia is on fire. All over the country, flames are consuming factories that support Vladimir Putin's war machine. State-controlled media claim everything is fine. But at night, Russians hear explosions and by day they see plumes of smoke on the horizon. Because Putin's invincible country has a fatal weakness. It is a country so large it's impossible to defend it all. A shooting target 9,000 kilometers wide. For months, Ukraine has attacked Putin's oil refineries and consequently, Russians now face long lines at the filling stations, where fuel products are rationed if available at all. Data from the St. Petersburg Stock Exchange reveal that, ironically, in the Russian petrol state, the wholesale of petrol has already dropped 21.7%. Putin has banned all fuel exports, and still the Russian business paper Kommersant reports that in Russian-occupied Crimea, the number of filling stations selling petrol has dropped by 50%. But Vladimir Putin wants no one to know. Officially, the state-controlled media attribute the fuel shortage to the vacation season because nothing underlines Russia's success like pretending that everyone was on long summer road trips that somehow consumed all the fuel. But in reality, the Russians are not tanking. The Russian economy is tanking. So, is Putin's war machine finally running out of fuel? Let's take a closer look. For many of us, our cultural reproductions have somewhat distorted our view of what war really is. In books, in movies, and to some extent even journalism, war is often all about the front line, because that is where the battles are raging. But in reality, soldiers on the front line are just the tip of the spear. Behind them are long logistics lines with trains and trucks that move supplies of weapons, ammunition, food, water, and other necessities. Sometimes hundreds, even thousands of kilometers before they reach the front line. Further back, behind the logistics lines, lie the factories that produce these supplies, sometimes using parts from other factories, forming an entire network of production facilities. And in the war in Ukraine, where the Russian war machine is financed by Russia, the Russian factories are indirectly backed by other production sites that generate federal income. For instance, Russian gold mines are not producing supplies for the front line, but instead they generate income for Putin's dictatorship, and thus finance the military production. All of these sites are crucial links in the supply chain that keeps the war going. And if any link breaks, the whole chain is broken. If winter comes, but the winter uniforms never arrive, soldiers may die in the cold. And as we have seen, Russian soldiers often surrender when running out of food. So logistics are crucial, but increasingly Putin's logistics are failing. And this is new. Because throughout history, Russia has had one unique advantage. Being the largest country on Earth, Russia has always had its supply chain well protected, far behind the front line. Think of the 1800s. Back then, soldiers would fire rifles with an effective range of only 200 meters, as shown here in Robert Gibbs' oil painting of the Scottish Highland Brigade defeating Russian cavalrymen in the Crimean War of 1853. Yes, named after that Crimea, which Putin is still fighting over. For greater range, these soldiers brought 9-pounder cannons to the battlefield that allowed them to attack targets 3 kilometers away. But the Russian logistics and factories further back were out of harm's way. Now that was the kind of war Putin could have won. Because 172 years ago, the outcome was determined by army size. And in 2022, when Putin invaded Ukraine, he had the bigger army. But unlike Putin's imperial ambitions, we are now in 2025, where warfare has evolved. Many will remember Ukraine used to have some long-range weapons, like the American ballistic missile, the ATACMS. But it came with some serious strings attached. The US only delivered a few missiles, and they introduced range limitations and wanted to approve each target, which is really not helpful if you have the intel that for the next 30 minutes, a Russian top general is at a specific location in Moscow. All those restrictions are now gone because of Ukraine's own weapons production, and thus targets on Russian territory can be hit immediately at Ukraine's own discretion. And Ukraine has developed some serious long-range weapons that dwarfs the old 9-pounder cannon and its 3-kilometer range. Drones and missiles of all shapes and sizes, from the smaller Lastivka all the way up to their latest innovation, the FP-5 Flamingo cruise missile, with its 3,000-kilometer range. Check out my previous episode for more about this game-changing weapon. So roughly speaking, in just 172 years, we have increased the weapons range by a factor of 1,000. And that changes war completely. Because now, war is no longer just a fight between riflemen on the front lines, but a battle between competing economies that try to outproduce each other while their entire supply chains are a target. Simplified, historic wars were won by firepower, but modern wars are won by logistics. This is the reason Russia is now burning. Because Ukraine understands the Russian military supply chain, and they are determined to break it. For Ukraine, targeting the supply chain has 3 important advantages. First, hitting Russian territory with long-range weapons fits Ukraine's manpower situation just perfectly. Ukraine is often outnumbered on the front line, so this is not the ideal place to fight. Instead, the deep strikes with long-range drones and missiles hits Putin's supply chain where it hurts, without risking Ukrainian lives at all. And second, Ukraine has an important supply chain advantage in that many links in their own supply chain are out of reach for Russia. For instance, the Leopard 2 tanks used by Ukraine are made by KNDS, a French-German company with factories all over Europe. Attacking this part of Ukraine's supply chain would be an attack on NATO, bringing 32 NATO countries into the war on Ukraine's side, which would be fatal for Russia. So in all likelihood, that is not on the table in Moscow. And third, economically, the two countries are very different. Because of the war, Ukraine is now heavily financed by external aid, especially from EU countries, but also from Canada, from the UK, and Japan. On the other hand, Putin's economy is mainly dependent on revenue from oil exports to China, India, and Turkey. These economic differences create an asymmetrical situation where Putin cannot prevent Ukraine's income, but Ukraine can attack every element of Putin's oil sector. So, throughout summer and into the fall, Ukraine has bombed a long range of oil refineries, some of them even multiple times. And Putin's problem is, it's only getting worse, because the frequency of Ukrainian long-range attacks are intensifying as Ukraine's production of long-range weapons increases, while at the same time more and more Russian air defense systems are destroyed, allowing more drones and missiles to get through the defenses. And remember, we are still only in autumn. When the harsh Russian winter comes and the demand for petrol spikes, the problems will only multiply. The damage caused by Ukrainian attacks can be difficult to repair. If you own a car, you know that accidentally smashing a taillight might be a relatively easy fix for your mechanic. But imagine flying a drone with 20 kilograms of explosives directly into your car. Then that car is just totaled. That is what's happening at Putin's oil refineries. It's not just a handle breaking or a pipe bursting somewhere. It's modern Ukrainian precision-guided weapons that hit the most difficult-to-repair areas of each refinery. Not just once, but repeatedly, until the entire refinery goes offline. So why does Vladimir Putin not stop these long-range attacks? Just like Ukraine, the Russians have multiple air defense systems, with the S-400 being the most important for intercepting the long-range weapons. The challenge is, all air defense systems have limitations. The S-400 utilizes a ground radar, which under ideal conditions can see an airplane at high altitude, at a distance of up to 340 kilometers. But because of Earth's curvature, a Ukrainian drone or cruise missile that flies low to the ground has to be quite close to the radar to be detected. For example, if Russia has its radar placed at a height of 10 meters, and a Ukrainian cruise missile flies at 50 meters, the missile would need to be less than 42 kilometers from the radar to risk detection. And that is a best-case scenario, because here I'm ignoring that cruise missiles can hide behind mountains, fly through valleys, hide in bad weather, etc. And because Russia has thousands of military targets scattered across the biggest country on Earth, it's impossible to cover it all with air defense systems. Putin's best bet is to create a wall of air defense along the front line, which is 1,200 kilometers long. So in theory, if we space S-400 systems 42 kilometers apart all across the front line, Russia would be a lot safer. But the Russian army would need at least 29 systems to cover it all. And it gets even worse as these systems are often relocated to keep them from being bombed by Ukraine. So let's say half of them are on the move, Russia would then need twice as many, so perhaps 58 systems. And that is on top of all the air defense systems that may be reserved for protecting military bases, Putin's Valdai residence, Putin's Black Sea Palace, his offices in Moscow, and so on. And herein lies the problem, because at the beginning of the war, Putin only had 56 of these complete systems. And from open source intelligence, we have visual confirmation that Russia has lost at least 16 missile launchers, 10 radars, and 2 command vehicles, all belonging to the S-400 systems. So it's safe to say Putin does not have 56 complete systems anymore. An information which is confirmed by reports that Russia is pressuring Turkey to buy back 4 systems they sold to Turkey in 2017. Finally, there is the cost. Were Putin to order new S-400 systems, they would cost $500 million per system, plus all the resources involved in training the highly specialized operators that are often killed when the systems are attacked. So in short, we are now in a phase of the war where attrition really hurts. Just like Putin has been running out of tanks, he is now running out of air defense systems. And the more holes Ukraine pokes in the defenses, the more Ukraine can hurt the Russian economy. In the short term, the fuel crisis in Russia is certainly an inconvenience for the Russian people. But for Putin, there is a much more serious problem long term. The reason is every citizen in every society lives under a social contract, an informal agreement between themselves and the people in power. For instance, if you live in Norway, you have accepted a social contract that involves paying high taxes in exchange for living in a very safe, very well-functioning society. In general, people accept the social contract if they conclude that it's for their own good. And apparently it's quite good in Norway, as the Norwegians have not rebelled since 1814. Both Ukrainians and Russians have accepted a social contract too, albeit two very different social contracts. Like Norway, Ukraine is a democracy. In 2019, the people elected President Zelensky with an impressive 75% of the vote in an election which was considered free and fair by the OSCE. And just like Norway, the social contract of Ukraine involves the government ensuring the safety of the people. But then came the war, and Putin has been bombing civilians in Ukraine ever since, thinking that maybe he could make the Ukrainians angry at their government for not protecting them. But the reason this doesn't work is Ukrainians know where the missiles are coming from. And they elected their own government, which is now doing everything possible to defeat Vladimir Putin and end the war. In that sense, the government and the people are on the same team, and the social contract is upheld. But that's not the situation in Russia. Vladimir Putin has been in power for 25 years, and while he pretends to hold democratic elections, they are neither free nor fair. In reality, the Russian people has zero influence on Putin's dictatorship. He just dragged them into a war with Ukraine, which no one really asked for. And this begs the question, when do the Russians rebel? Since 2022, the Russian pollster Levada Center has measured how Russians reply to the question, should the war continue or should peace negotiations begin? The red and the yellow respondents are those who want peace negotiations. And in September of 2022, a combined 48% already wanted peace, more than the 44% who wanted more war. But look at August 2025. Now it's a combined 66% who want peace negotiations and just 27% who want war. It's somewhat surprising that this took 3 years, but the reason is the Russian people have been groomed into accepting a very dystopian social contract, where everyone keeps their head down and then no one gets hurt by the regime. You can see this in street interviews. Whenever Russians are asked a political question, the most common response is, I am apolitical, meaning they have no interest in politics, because in Putin's dictatorship the silent survive while the critics fall out of windows. So to some extent, Putin is in control of how people think. But his problem is, even this Orwellian social contract only exists as long as he's able to uphold a reasonably well-functioning society. Back in the 1980s, we saw increasing dissatisfaction with Russia's war in Afghanistan, which was seen by many as the root cause of the failing economy. Especially the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers was very active in organizing large protests, even in Moscow. And finally, in 1989, Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev had to end the invasion. So to Putin, the danger is history repeating, as the Russian economy is increasingly under pressure. The Russians have seen inflation rates close to 18% and consumer loan rates of 30%. Russians can no longer travel abroad, many foreign-made goods are unavailable, it's difficult to buy international spare parts, they have medicine supply problems, etc., etc. It is in this difficult situation that Ukraine is now destroying Putin's main source of income. Putin has completely ignored the need for a green transition, and so oil is the very bloodstream of the Russian economy. And when Russian car owners now drive up to filling stations, they see signs that the fuel is reserved for organizations, which of course includes Putin's regime, but not the people. Winter is coming, and with it, the booming demand for fuel as temperatures drop below -20 degrees Celsius. Without petrol, roads will not be cleared. Deliveries of groceries, medical supplies, and other crucial items will be delayed. Without their cars, workers will find it difficult to get to work, and factories will face delays in the delivery of materials needed for production. So how long will the Russian social contract hold when family members start dying because the medicine never arrives or someone could not get to the hospital? Putin has often tried to rewrite history, but there is one historic fact he will find it hard to get around. Rulers of Russia have all been very different, but all rulers have one thing in common. Rarely do they die of old age.